Welcome to Chapter 8, Risk, Response, and Recovery. So we'll discuss and describe the principles of risk management, our common responses and techniques, and issues related to recovery of IT systems. Our key concepts are quantitative and qualitative risk assessment approaches, business impact analysis, BIA, business continuity plan, or BCP, incident handling, and disaster recovery plan, or DRP. Risk management and information security. They seek a balance between the utility and cost of various risk management options. We don't want to spend more to protect an asset than it's worth. A countermeasure without a corresponding risk is a solution seeking a problem, and it's difficult to justify the cost. So really you just don't secure it just because it can be secured. There's needs to be a reason. There's something you need to mitigate, a risk or some issue that you're trying to protect against. Risk terminology. A threat is something generally bad that might happen. A vulnerability, any exposure that could allow a threat to be realized. Risk is the likelihood that a particular threat will be realized against a specific vulnerability. And then the impact, the amount of harm a threat exploiting a vulnerability can cause. Event, a measurable occurrence that has an impact on the business. An incident, any event that violates or threatens to violate your security policy. Control includes both safeguards and countermeasures. Safeguard addresses gaps or weaknesses in controls that could lead to a realized threat. Countermeasures counters or addresses a specific threat. The elements of risk, right? So you have your assets, you have the threats that could happen to the assets, and then the vulnerabilities that allow the threats to occur. So the purpose of risk management, we need to identify the risk before they lead to an incident in time to enable you to plan and begin risk handling activities, controls and countermeasures. And it's on a continuous basis across the life of the product, system, or project or organization. It's just continuing. It's always continuing, your risk management. And here is the process, right? So you identify your risk, evaluate your risk, evaluation of risk, the risk impact, recommendation of risk reducing measures, so risk mitigations, right? So the types of mitigations you could choose to avoid the risk. There's actual risk mitigation where you put in a control or something to prevent or reduce the amount of risk. Risk acceptance, you just say that you're willing to accept the risk if it occurs, because the cost is maybe too expensive to put a countermeasure in place for. You can transfer the risk, get insurance or some kind of other third party that will take on the risk for you, and then you'll evaluate the risk and assurance, and then you have the assessment again. On a rotating periodic evaluation, you maybe every 90 days, every 6 months, every 3 years. You're assessing things on a regular basis, and you're going through this cycle. Ways to identify risks. So you could be brainstorming, surveys, interviews, work groups, checklists, historical information. There's all kinds of ways to figure out what potential risks there are. A risk register is a register that contains your risk. It'll have a description of the risk, expected impact if the event occurs, the probability of the event occurring, steps to mitigate the risk, steps to take should the event occur, and rank of the risk. This is your risk register. Emerging threats, right? Two of the most common areas of emerging threats are cloud and virtualization, right? As organizations move toward outsourcing data and processing to cloud service providers, they encounter new threats. So you always have new technologies, changes in the culture of organization or environment, unauthorized use of technology, changes in regulations, laws, changes in business practices, right? So cloud and virtualization hits this on numerous levels. But there are others. They're not just the only areas that have threats. Static environments. So supervisory control and data acquisitions, or SCADA. Embedded systems, mobile devices, mainframes, gaming consoles, vehicle systems. These are all environments that could have threats and risks. Assessing the risk quantitatively attempts to describe risk in financial terms and put a dollar value on each risk. Qualitatively ranks risks based on their probability of occurrence and impact on the business operations. Right, so quantitatives, right, numerically based, hard data, financial data, it's very objective. Qualitative is scenario based, maybe some soft data, and soft oriented is subjective. It feels like it's more risky, right? Instead of this is going to cost us X million dollars. Quantitative is in dollar amounts or physical hard data. Whereas qualitative is it's the probability. We got a 30% chance we believe, and it might do this, right? It's subjective. Calculating quantified risk, right? So the actual asset value, calculate the exposure value, calculate the single loss expectancy. So if it happens one time, right? What is that? The single loss, if the actuary calculates the effective loss of a late model SUV is 20%, then every time he receives a claim, all he needs to do is look up the asset value, multiply by the effective loss, and he'll have a very good prediction of the payout. This allows the actuary to calculate insurance premiums accurately and reduce the risk of the insurance company losing money, right? So that's the single loss expectancy, right? What do we expect on any one loss, right? And then determine how often a loss is likely to occur every year, right? Is this, one time every 10 years, right? Or, a 10% chance to happen, or is it something that happens, 3 times a year, right? How likely is it to occur? And then determine the annualized loss expectancy, right? So if it happens, once every 10 years, it's 10%. Say it was $20,000 loss, but it might only occur once every 10 years, so it's a $2,000 annual loss. Whereas if it occurs 3 times a year and it's $20,000, then your annualized loss is $60,000. So what is its annualized loss? And here's just going over the examples, right? The asset value times effective loss, and the single loss expectancy, and then the number of incidents per year gives you the annualized loss expectancy. Qualitative, right, is the probability or likelihood of an impact, and what is it? Very likely, unlikely, almost certain, rare, and then if it does occur, is it a significant loss, catastrophic, insignificant, minor? Plan a risk response. So negative risks, right? You want to reduce, transfer, accept, or avoid, right? Positive risks, you want to exploit, share, enhance, and accept. And then the acceptable range of risk, right? So where's an acceptable amount of risk for the company? Because you may accept it. You may just say it's okay if it happens. Maybe or your organization does $60 billion a year in sales, And so anything under $1 million, they is acceptable risk. They won't spend the time mitigating. Maybe you choose that way. Or maybe it's 100,000. Or something like that. There's a risk threshold, or it may even be $50. Right? You can be very risk averse. But where's that acceptable range of risk for your organization? And then total risk and residual risk, right? So you add up your threats, vulnerabilities, assets, and that's your total risk. Then you have your mitigation controls, your transference, etc. What's left is your residual risk. What are you not able to control? And is that acceptable? And implement the risk response plan. You have some administrative controls, so manage the activity phase of security, the things people do, and then the activity phase controls, either administrative or technical, and correspond to the life cycle of a security program. Excuse me. You have detective controls, identify that a threat has landed in your system. An intrusion detection system is an example of a detective control. Preventative controls, stop threats from coming in contact with the vulnerability. An example of a preventative control is an intrusion prevention system. It prevents the threat, and so that's preventative control. Corrective controls, reduces the effects of a threat. When you reload an operating system after it is infected with malware, where you are using a corrective control. Forensics and incident response are another example of corrective controls. Deterrent controls deter an action that could result in a violation. There's a fine line between deterrent controls and preventative controls. Deterrent controls merely attempt to suggest that a subject not take some action, whereas preventative controls do not allow the action to occur. So, for example, a sign that says "Do not enter," but the door is unlocked. Right? The "Do not enter" sign is a deterrent control, but the actual lock, if the door is locked, that's a preventative control. Compensating controls are designed to address a threat in place of a preferred control that is too expensive or difficult to implement. So it's just an alternative to a preferred control. It's a compensating control. It does some effect, but maybe it's not the best, but it's a lot cheaper. Protecting physical security, right? So our safety plans, include escape plans, escape routes, drills, controlling testing. We have HVAC, fire suppression, shielding, signs, lighting, surveillance, access lists, and then our safety plan, right? So it's all this is about physical security. Selecting countermeasures, fix known exploitable software flaws, develop and enforce operational procedures and access controls, providing encryption capabilities, improve physical security, disconnect unreliable networks. These are all potential countermeasures. Monitor and control risk response. What problem is the countermeasure designed to solve? Does the countermeasure solve the problem? Countermeasures may pose new risks to the organizations. Perform certification and accreditation of countermeasure programs. Follow best practices and exercise due diligence. Business continuity management, BCM, right? It includes a business continuity plan, or BCP. A business continuity plan contains the actions needed to keep critical business processing running after a disruption. Disruptions can be minor, such as a power outage, or major, such as weather damage that makes an organization's building unusable, right? Destroys, flattens the building. Disaster recovery plan, DRP, details the steps to recover from a disruption and restore the infrastructure necessary for normal business operations. And disruptions, once again, include extreme weather, terrorists, operational or application failures. Business impact analysis is an analysis of the business to determine what kinds of events will have an impact on what systems. And that's your BIA, business impact analysis. What kind of impact? What events could impact the business and how? Critical business functions, CBFs. Once the BIA has identified the business systems that have an incident that will affect it, you must rank the systems from most to least critical. The ranking determines whether the business can survive and for how long in the absence of the critical function. Right? So what are your most critical functions and areas? If the XYZ app is down or system is down, how long will the business survive? Right? And you rank them in order. And then maximum tolerable downtime. That's the most time a business can survive without a particular critical system. A major disruption is an event that makes the critical business function unavailable for longer than its maximum tolerable downtime. Each of the disaster planning and mitigation solutions must be able to recover critical business functions within their maximum tolerable downtime. And systems and functions with the shortest maximum tolerable downtime are often the most critical. The next section will cover this topic in more detail. Recovery time object, the time frame for restoring a critical business function. A recovery time object must be shorter than or equal to the maximum tolerable downtime. So recovery point objective, incidents can cause loss of data. You must calculate the amount of tolerable data loss for each business function. Recovery procedures must be able to meet the minimums defined here. If the business can afford to lose up to 1 day's data, then nightly backups might be an acceptable solution. However, if the business must prevent all data loss, a redundant server or storage solution will then be required. Emergency Operations Centers, or EOC. The EOC is the place where the recovery team will meet and work during a disruption. Many businesses have more than one Emergency Operations Center, and one might be nearby for use in the event of a building fire, for example, and another might be significant distance away for use in the event of an earthquake or a regional power outage. Any component that, if it fails, could interrupt business process is called a single point of failure. Deploying two or more components that are capable of providing the same service, called redundancy, helps increase an organization's ability to avoid downtime. This is also called fault tolerance. Assessing the maximum tolerable downtime, MTD, right? So maximum tolerable downtime is the period of time in which a business can survive a disabled critical function. The RTO, recovery time objective, the amount of time needed to recover a business process, often made up of several interlinked RTOs. And the RPO, recovery point objective, the point to which data must be recovered. The business impact analysis, right? Security professionals should ask two questions. What can affect the business? How will it affect the business? Conduct the business impact analysis for these reasons. You want to set a value of each business unit or resource as it relates to how the entire organization operates. Identify critical needs to develop a business recovery plan, and set order of priority for restoring the organization's functions after a disruption. This is your guidance. This is your tool to help determine how your organization will survive in the event of a disruption. Critical dependencies, right? What data or information processing does that system, critical business function, require? What personnel, what communications, what equipment, what facilities, other organizational functions, vendors, suppliers, what is used by that critical business function and will not, and will impact it if it were to be gone or have issues. Assessing the impact of downtime, right? People, how will you notify them of the incident and its impact? How you evacuate, transport, and care for employees, including, for example, how do you pay them in a disaster? Who will step in if key personnel are incapacitated or unavailable? This is called succession planning, and you must have one. Systems, what portions of your computing and telecommunications infrastructure must you duplicate immediately? How long do you have? A minute, an hour, a day? Data, what data is critical to running your business? How will you recover critical data that is lost? Property, what items are essential to your business? Things like tools, supplies, special forms, all must be recoverable or easily replaced. Very important. Review and test the plan. It's important to review and update your business continuity plan regularly. Test for a BCP and DRP. You have checklists, structured walkthrough. Maybe you just have analysts sitting at a table and you walk through what items would be done to restore. Then you actually do a simulation. You actually go through in a simulated environment exercise of recovering from a disaster, and then parallel you actually have a production environment stood up in parallel with your current one, and then a full interruption. You actually simulate. You not even simulate. You actually have a full interruption disaster recovery plan, but you need to test. You at least need to do the simulation testing, and at the very, very minimum, the simulation. I think a checklist and structured walkthroughs are good, but you need to get into a test environment and at least try to get it at least at that level. Backing up data and applications, plans must include dealing with backup storage media, locations, and access. Backups provide extra copies of needed resources such as data, documentation, equipment. Full backups, as the name implies, is a full copy of everything, right? It's usually tape or CD or disc or whatever, but it's a backup of everything. Differential data. This type is, you start off with a full backup, maybe say on Sunday night when traffic's light. And then Monday through Saturday, you back up the changes made since Sunday's full backup. As the week progresses, each night backup takes a little bit longer, but you only need the Sundays and then the last backup to restore. Incremental backups, though, you start with the full backup, once again, when traffic is light on Sunday, and then you only back up that day's changes. As the week progresses, the nightly incremental backup takes about the same amount of time, because it's just doing the changes, but then you need all the backups to restore. Whereas with differential, you only need 2. A full backup, you only need 1. Incremental, you would need all that had happened since Sunday, because you got just the day's changes occurring. Incident handling. Preparation, identification, notification, response, recovery, and follow-up, documentation, and reporting. Right. So preparation is you need to have your teams or your response teams in place and have some procedures in place. And then identification. What happened, who's needed involved, and then how do we notify them. How do we handle the response, and we actually do the response, get things back up, recovery, and then do the follow-up, and then document and report out what our findings were, why did it happen, and how can we prevent it. Recovery from a disaster. DRP, a disaster recovery plan, establishes an emergency operations center as an alternative location from which the business continuity plan or disaster recovery plan will be coordinated and implemented from. It also names the Emergency Operations Center manager and determines when that manager should declare an incident a disaster. Activating the disaster recovery plan to restore business operations and return operations to the original state before the disaster. operating in a reduced, modified environment. You suspend normal processes, identify minimum recovery resources as part of the recovery, combine services that were on different hardware platforms onto common servers. Continue to make backups of data and systems. So you try what you have to get everything to work, and you may give up some features in a reduced capacity to make sure that you can just continue business. Primary steps to disaster recovery: ensure the safety of individuals. People, safety comes first. Then you try to contain the damage, and then assess the damage and begin recovery according to your disaster recovery plan and business continuity plan. Restoring damaged systems. Know where to get configuration charts, inventory lists, backup applications, and data. Have access control lists to make sure that the system allows only legitimate users in. Update the operating system and applications with the most current patches. Make sure the operating system applications are current and secure. Activate the access control rules, directories, and remote access systems to permit users to get on the new systems. Some alternatives, right? You might have a dedicated site operated by the business, such as a secondary processing center. You may be a commercially leased facility, such as a hot site or a mobile facility, or you may have an agreement with an internal or external facility. Comparing common recovery site options, right? So you got the hot site. It's going to be the most costly. Computer equipment is already in place, connectivity is already in place, data is already in place, it already has staffing, and typical lead times to readiness is maybe a few minutes to a couple hours at most, right, to switch over from production to your hot site. A warm site cost is high, but they say medium, but it's still a high cost, for a warm site. It's got some cost to it because you have some computer equipment already designated. You have the connectivity of the equipment already there, but you probably don't have data on site, right? And it's probably not staffed and not operational totally. So it may take you hours to several days in order to get a warm site up and running. A cold site, right, is a lower cost. There's no equipment, no connectivity, no data, and no staff, but you have an agreement that you have the ability to put computer equipment and that in place. And so this may take several days to weeks to stand up. And then multiple sites, so you might have redundancy built in. So there's no direct costs, but there are costs. But you may be spreading the load out, say over 3 geographically dispersed sites, one on the East Coast, one on the Central time zone, and one on the West Coast, right? And you spread out your traffic evenly through them. But if one of the sites goes down, the other 2 can pick up the added traffic. So there's no direct actual cost other than you do have to spec them higher so that they can handle load more than that they normally work at. But you get the redundancy built in, and the computer equipment's already there, the connectivity's already there, the data can already be there, and you're already staffed it, and it may take seconds to minutes to switch over in that case. May automatically happen, in fact, just depending on how the systems are set up. There's literally no downtime. So those are some of the recovery site options. And that concludes our Chapter 8. And so we discussed our quantitative and qualitative risk assessment approaches. We discussed what a business impact analysis is and when to do one and why we're doing it. We covered the business continuity plan, or BCP, and the importance of that. and incident handling and disaster recovery plans, or DRPs. That was Chapter 8, and we will catch you over in Chapter 9.